I am Frank Schumpert, your host, and you are listening to the Empires of History podcast, the Ottoman series, episode 6, Rebellious Sons and the Karamanids. If you are new to Empires, I thank you for stopping by. If you are a returning listener, many thanks as well. I thank you also for subscribing on Apple Podcast, Stitcher, and Spotify, and visiting the show's website at all one word, Empiresofhistorypodcast.blueberry.net. That last part is spelled BLUBRRY.net, where you can comment and subscribe. Feel like supporting the show? You can always leave me a review on Apple Podcast, Stitcher, or Spotify. Or, if you're feeling really generous, you can stop in at Patreon under the show's page and make a donation. Any little bit would help. As usual, if you feel I can improve the show, please feel free to drop me a line at empiresofhistorypodcast@gmail.com. I hope you enjoy the show. In episode 5, we left Sultan Murad off with a victory after the Battle of Chernomen. This victory, as we covered in that episode, helped to ensure Adrianople, now renamed Edirne, was securely in Ottoman hands, as well as serving as their capital. After the victory, Ottoman forces pushed into Bulgaria, grabbing towns and cities and assimilating them over a gradual 10-year period. The Sultan sent his forces storming into Serbia sometime in the year 1371, implementing the Ottomans' old MO of supporting pretenders to thrones, as well as exploiting the many religious divisions that existed. Thus, by the 1370s, not only had the Ottomans taken over most of southern Bulgaria, but they were steadily pushing into Serbia as well. While Sultan Murad enjoyed victories in Europe, trouble in Anatolia was brewing. Local Turkish lords looked at the growing power of Murad with fear and envy, and began to make trouble wherever they could. The biggest threat, however, came from the aforementioned Karamanids from episode 5, who were causing all sorts of antics in central Anatolia. In assessing these threats, Sultan Murad would display a powerful political mind and a guru's sense of patience as he carefully played the long game. Whereas most medieval rulers during those times, both Christian and Muslim, seemed driven by notions of glory and honor, Sultan Murad was a different man entirely. He realized that in order to best his Anatolian opponents, he'd need massive military power at his back. The kind of super military power that could only come from conquering lands in Christian Europe and then implementing careful policies of assimilation, and not enslavement or debasement, and turn the conquered citizenry into a mighty force. Only after the Ottomans had built this well-oiled, multinational war machine could they turn it upon the Muslim emirs in the east. Thus, Murad pursued a grand strategy of avoiding fighting a war on two fronts, but sought to maneuver his enemies so he could concentrate his energies from one side of the empire to the next. After securing his European flank in 1373, Sultan Murad set out with the Byzantine Emperor John V, who was serving as the Sultan's vassal, to Anatolia, intent on dealing with the troublesome Turkic beys in the area. But even before he got going on his campaign, trouble was brewing in the Sultan's own household. I haven't talked much on this topic until now, but in the House of Osman, male members lived under a very dark shadow since their birth. Although Sultan Murad had been appointed as the successor to Orhan, upon assuming the throne, one of Murad's first orders had been the execution of his living brothers, so that no male relative could stake a claim on the throne. After having sons of his own then, Murad had prepped each of the boys for the power that one of them might someday wield by awarding them commands and lands and governorships. On the one hand, the boys were given the opportunity to learn the arts of war, government, administration, logistics, and leadership, and helped ensure that any future Ottoman sultan would come from a rigorous school of hard knocks, where they were exposed to the realities of the world and not shielded from it within palace walls. On the other hand, however, boys born into the imperial family would find themselves thrown into a life-or-death race to please their father, attract support of the major families, improve their worth in battle. Tied up in this struggle were the behind-the-scenes machinations of their mothers, very powerful women in their own right, who courted support for their sons from the various notables in the empire, ordered assassinations, and sold high offices to those who would best benefit their sons. To lose this race meant not only the sons not chosen to be sultan would be executed, but also any sons they produced and their mothers would be exiled to the provinces to a life of hardship. In this world, it didn't pay to be weak, indecisive, unpopular, or lack the stomach for backstabbing. Drawing this exact same conclusion was the youngest of Sultan Murad's 4 sons, Savshi. Savshi was the son of one of Murad's later wives, and against the Ottoman tradition of rearing of boys that may someday be sultan and a rigorous regime of military and government education, Savshi found himself cast away and mostly secluded to a life of quiet luxury. However, in his mid-20s, at some point, Savshi seemed to have done some math and realized, 1. Hey, all my brothers are receiving military training to become sultan one day. 2. Whoever becomes sultan will kill the rest of his brothers. And finally, 3. Why isn't good old Dad giving me military commands? Why aren't I the governor of some city or province by now? Maybe I've been written off. I don't even have a shot. I might be as good as dead. Judging that he had nothing to lose, Savshi placed all his hope in a plot that was hatched between himself and close friends, who were some disaffected cousins of the Ottoman family. His reasoning went like this. If he could rally enough discontents around him, he just might be able to force Murad into retirement, or at least off the throne and himself put in place. Though Murad was a successful sultan, his reforms of the military and civil offices, of which we will get into later in this episode, he had alienated extended family and some notables in the empire in the process. To pull off this long shot, Savshi would need first the treasury in Bursa, in which to bribe officials and raise an army if needed, and second, he'd need a powerful ally. Along came the son of the Byzantine emperor, Andronicus. Without getting into too much of Andronicus' long backstory, it is a confusing maze of Byzantine palace intrigue, believe me. Suffice it to say that at some point in 1372, the boys made contact with one another. Andronicus was angry at his father, who was John V, for pretty much the same reason Savshi was, of being passed over in favor of older siblings. Although Savshi had to admit the optics of his brewing usurpation didn't look all that tidy. What, with a Muslim prince allying himself with a Christian prince? It still served a purpose that Andronicus could provide some troops and at least make sure there was no trouble from the west if this rebellion were successful. All the duo had to do was sit and wait for Murad to go marching off with the main Ottoman army, and away from Bursa, the seat of the Ottoman treasury and the base of Savshi's plot. Their opportunity came in 1373, like I said earlier, as not only was Sultan Murad taken the army into Anatolia, but he had also the Byzantine Emperor John V, Andronicus's father, with him as well, providing a golden opportunity for both Savshi and Andronicus to make their move. As Sultan Murad and John V pushed into central Anatolia to confront the Karamanids, Savshi seized the imperial treasury in Bursa and declared himself sultan. His fellow usurper Andronicus was in Constantinople at the time and followed suit and had himself declared emperor. Once set up in Bursa, Savshi waited to see who would come flocking to his banner. The only problem was no one exactly came. Aside from a few mercenaries and disaffected cousins, no other prominent men from the Ottoman establishment cared to aid Sopshi. The Olma stayed away, as did the local judges and administrators, probably sensing better than most the wrath that was headed their way. When word reached Sultan Murad that his son had entered into a rebellious alliance with a Christian Byzantine prince, he lost that stately calm that was so much a constant of his character. His vassal, Emperor John V, was in a fit too, and both fathers, at the head of their armies, rushed toward Bursa as fast as they could march. News of Murad's approach shocked the supporters around Sovshi, and many quickly fled. Sovshi also turned tail and ran along with a few supporters and a small number of troops, and crossed the Bosporus to an area about 20 miles southwest of Constantinople. The angry fathers caught up and confronted their sons. But before a battle could be fought, Murad, proving the old adage that youth and ambition will always be overcome by old age and treachery, managed to sneak messages to the commanders of Sovshi's army. Sovshi watched in horror as his small army switched sides before any fighting could begin. The two rebels then fled to the Greek city of Demotika, where they were given shelter, but then the Sultan armies camped outside the walls and prepared to lay siege. The city leaders, perhaps pondering upon the old saw of make haste and repent in leisure, quickly regretted giving aid and shelter to the two rebellious upstarts. The elders of the city must have decided that sheltering the young man might be bad for their health, so they decided to turn both men out to the Ottomans, much to the young men's chagrin. Justice was swift and final for Andronicus and Sovshi. Taken into custody, Sovshi was immediately blinded and tortured, then later executed upon Murad's orders. Andronicus was seized and blinded by having hot boiling vinegar poured into his eyes. Sultan Murad beseeched John V to have him executed as well. But the old father couldn't kill his own son and spared him. Andronicus, it would seem, would get the last laugh after all, as his own son would later become emperor after John V died, much to his other brother's great annoyance. Sometime after the unsuccessful rebellion of the two sons, and really throughout his reign, Murad solidified the process set in motion by Orhan in building the foundations of empire. The Sultan established the dual military and civilian office of Kaza Askir. This position was in charge of military affairs during peacetime and during war, dispense justice in the Sultan's camp to soldiers breaking regulations or disregarding discipline. The office of Kazi Askir would figure prominently in later Ottoman courts as the Sultan found the governance of his ever-growing empire too much for one man to bear. In addition to Kazi Askir was the office of Bey-ler-Beyli, or commander-in-chief of a region. After the Serbian attack at Chernomen, the Sultan had realized that local commanders would have to take charge, and though Lalu was as capable a man as any, the establishment of the office had the effect of officially designating one man in charge of military operations in the Sultan's absence during an emergency. During times of peace, the Beyler-Beyli was charged with the maintenance of military roads and ensuring equipment and arms were kept at the ready. Perhaps his most notable creation was the official position of Grand Vizier. The Grand Vizier, also pronounced Vizier depending on the sources, would serve the Sultan as a first minister of sorts, being the Sultan's right-hand man in all affairs, whether they be military or civilian. The Grand Vizier's role would come to be an indispensable office in the maintenance of the empire. Sultan Murad also broke with the tradition of placing close family members in important official jobs. hence the disaffected distant family members who supported Savcı's rebellion, and opened the important new roles up to men of talent and ambition regardless of their birth, a move that would ensure a steady supply of able-bodied, fiercely loyal, and intelligent men of incredible talent for service to the state for generations to come. In terms of power, authority, and proximity to the Sultan, the Grand Vizier would stand above all other office holders in the empire. In the aftermath of the imperial son's rebellion, Sultan Murad not only implemented these administrative and military changes, but he still had a problem in the east. The Ottoman eastern flank in Anatolia was still unsecured. The borders were flexible to say the least and porous at best. In the center of Anatolia, the large town of Ankara, modern-day capital of the Republic of Turkey, was being threatened by the encroaching forces of the Karamanid emir. Though Ankara wasn't officially a part of the empire, the Ottomans had a vested interest in seeing that it remained neutral at least. Ankara controlled the routes leading into the Ottomans' main holdings in western Anatolia, and if the city fell to an invading army, they would soon have a clear shot to Bursa, and then possibly push into Europe itself. At this point in the empire's history, the city was simply too far away for direct control. Therefore, it had been the policy of Murad, early in his reign, to secure his eastern flank by strategic marriages to his sons with the daughters of Turkish beys or by threats of military interventions, thereby making would-be enemies, at least on paper, friends. Seeking to test Ottoman resolve, the Karamanids around this time then set out for Ankara with the intention of occupying the city which had prompted Sultan Murad's military response in the first place. The rebellion of the two sons gave the Karamanids time to fortify their capital city, Konya, which they knew the Ottomans would attempt to besiege. Setting out now, finally, in the year 1386, with a large army behind him, composed of his elite Janissary units, numbering some 1,000 or 2,000, multiple contingents of cavalry troops, and also especially Christian, Serbian, and Bulgarian troops that were provided to the Sultan as vassals. All told, this totaled some 15,000 to 20,000 men in all. The military expedition seemed like a test of Murad's strategic theory that the East could only be brought to bear by the force of arms recruited and funded by his European holdings. The going proved tough in Anatolia. Fellow Turkic beys didn't look kindly on Muslims fighting Muslims, and therefore refused to give aid or supplies to either side. This meant both the Ottomans and Karamanids had to rely upon their own baggage trains and logistical support networks, severely limiting force projection of both armies. All too aware of the rather poor optics of Muslims fighting Muslims, especially since one side had Christian troops helping them, the standing order of Sultan Murad as the army marched was for the troops to remain in good order and discipline, and he charged the Kazi Askir with seeing that the troops didn't raid, plunder, or loot the surrounding countryside. An order that was ignored by the Serbian and Bulgarian troops, who happily raped, plundered, and murdered the inhabitants as they went along. So bad their conduct, the Sultan was forced to stop on a few occasions and execute entire units of Serbians, such that the casualties suffered by the Christian troops nearly all came from the Sultan's harsh sword rather than by enemy action. So remember, kids, when you're off fighting with the Ottomans and the Sultan gives an order not to plunder, you'd best obey. If you decide not to heed my advice, I don't want you coming home and complaining about how mean the Sultan is, how he had your friends executed, and how bad it felt when you were tied to a post and received 50 lashes for stealing a chicken. You have been warned. The only action both sides really encountered while on the march were small hit-and-run attacks. The Karamanids didn't want to take the field against the Ottomans and risk everything in an open-pitch battle. The Ottomans were able to march on the Karamanid city of, and guys, I know I'm butchering this word, so please bear with me, Kastamonu. With the fall of this city, the Ottomans chased the Karamanids to their now very fortified city of Konya, where they laid a siege. You might be thinking at this point that the Ottomans were holding most of the cards. After all, they had successfully taken the city of Kastamonu and secured Ankara, and had proven themselves adept at siege warfare. But as Sultan Murad assessed his situation, 3 things became apparent that would cause him to make peace as best he could. First, Konya was very, very well fortified for the time, and to take the city would require heavy cannon the Ottomans were famous for, yet they hadn't taken these weapons on the expedition. To get them from Europe would be risky and take far too long. Meanwhile, a frontal assault on Konya would be costly in lives, and should the assault fail, it would no doubt damage the reputation and prestige of Murad so much that while he had crushed his incipient son Savshi easily, he had only been able to do so because the army still supported him, and Savshi had been unable to rally support to his cause. But a battlefield defeat at the gates of Konya and a military expedition that was rapidly failing on the propaganda front might induce one of his other more powerful and well-connected sons to start getting ideas. Second, though he had technically secured Ankara, he knew the Ottomans could never control it being so far away. But the Sultan could save face by being able to boast of the capture of Kastamonu and the expulsion of the Karamanids from Ankara. At the very least, he could ensure that the city wouldn't serve as a base for an invasion of the Ottoman western portions in Anatolia. Third, as would be the future pattern from now on, reports from his Beylerbeyli in the Balkan countries were that the Christians were getting uppity and testing Ottoman strength, taking full advantage of the Sultan's absence. These reports took on a grim turn in 1388, when word reached Sultan Murad that the capable commander Lalo had suffered a terrible defeat at the hands of some Bosnians. The sources aren't very clear on the exact size of the Ottoman force under Lalo, which means it was probably a sizable force, and later Ottoman historians sought to cover up the disaster by giving it fuzzy, abstract, hard-to-pin-down names like, quote, larger than a raiding force, but not an army, and perhaps my personal favorite quote, a host great enough to besiege Sofia, but not a very large force. Yeah, okay guys, we get it, Ottomans. You got beat up, but it didn't hurt. Though the exact size of the force is up for debate, the political fallout from the defeat is not. Sultan Murad read reports stating that a crusade had been called upon by all Christians in the Balkans to follow up their victory with a general invasion of the Ottomans in Europe. At the center of this call was a Serbian king named Lazar. Lazar, or his father, had been nominally supported by Ottoman forces when he sought the throne, a part of Serbia called Morava some years back. Now it seemed to Sultan Murad that Lazar had turned coat and was working against him. The Sultan then had no choice but to hurry up and bury the hatchet with the Karamid emir. This he did in the mid-1388, with the emir kissing the Sultan's hand in a sign of submission outside the gates of Konya in an elaborate ceremony. Murad thus departed the region without tribute, vassalage, or promise of military aid from the Karamanids, and headed back to Europe at full speed. When the Sultan arrived in Europe, he did so with a mind to round off strategic corners of the empire and enlarge it through an all-encompassing campaign to grab up Bulgaria, Serbia, and march up north and teach those pesky Bosnians a little lesson or two. In the next episode, we will see that everyone learned a lesson in the end. The Bosnians learned that though the Ottomans appeared far away on the map, they were actually really very close, and the Sultan would learn never to trust a Serbian lord. Also, in the next episode, I plan on covering the defeat of Lalu that brought the Sultan out of Anatolia and back into Europe. Thanks for listening, and thank you too for leaving a review on iTunes or Apple Podcast as it's called now. Please shoot me an email. I'd love to hear from you. I see that we are approaching over 120 listeners of the show, and any feedback would be greatly appreciated. Many thanks.